Police tell me their suspect is 20-year-old Terrell Gibson from West Palm Beach, and they say he used this gun to shoot those people, including his own cousin.
It was a Monday evening, the kind where nothing feels out of place. Cars pulling into driveways, kids being called inside for dinner, neighbors sitting on their steps, holding on to the last stretch of Florida heat. Normal, quiet, ordinary. And then, gunfire. Not one shot, not two. 18 rounds tore through the Azure Estates apartment complex in Riviera Beach, Florida, shattering that calm in seconds. People dropped, others ran. Some didn't even understand what was happening, until it was already too late. And that was just the beginning. By the time it was over, one man was dead. 4 others were bleeding in the street. A pastor had been shot. Drivers were targeted while sitting behind their own steering wheels. And somewhere on Interstate 95, a stolen black Chevrolet Silverado was speeding north, carrying the person responsible away from the chaos he had just created. A 20-year-old, Tremonte Terrell Gibson, still convinced, completely convinced, that he had done nothing wrong. So what turns an ordinary evening into something like this? But one of them wasn't just caught in the chaos. He stepped into John Richard Halliburton III, wasn't running away like everyone else. He was moving toward the danger, toward the man holding the gun, toward someone he knew, someone he trusted. His own cousin. Witnesses would later describe a moment that didn't make sense. A split-second decision where John tried to intervene, tried to stop the shooting before anyone else got hurt. And for a brief moment, it almost looked like he could. But then, more shots, and John collapsed. The same person who had called him, the same person he came to help, was the one who pulled the trigger. So the question is, and how does it all spiral out of control so fast? Before we get into this, if you're watching right now, take a second to subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories reach around the world. John Richard Halliburton III wasn't a stranger to the people around him. In Riviera Beach, he was part of the everyday rhythm of the community. Someone you'd see, someone you'd recognize, someone whose presence felt familiar. He was 25 years old, at an age where life is still unfolding, where relationships, responsibilities, and future plans are all taking shape. But more than anything, John was known as someone who valued family. In communities like his, family isn't just a word, it's structure, support, and identity. Cousins grow up like brothers. They share spaces, memories, and experiences that outsiders rarely understand. And from everything known about John, that connection mattered to him. He wasn't distant. He wasn't detached. He showed up when needed. And on that day, he did exactly that. The call that brought him to the apartment complex didn't come from a stranger. It came from someone within his own circle, his cousin, Tremonte Gibson. Someone he had history with. Someone he had likely been around countless times before. There was familiarity there, a level of trust that only comes from shared blood and shared life. There's something powerful about that kind of connection. When family calls, you don't question it the same way you would with others. You don't hesitate. You don't assume danger. You assume it's real. You assume it matters. And that's exactly what makes this case so difficult to process. Because John didn't walk into that situation expecting conflict. He walked in thinking he was helping. People who knew him understood that about him, that he wasn't the kind of person to ignore someone reaching out. If anything, he leaned into those moments. He stepped forward, and in his final moments, that instinct didn't change. When the situation turned violent, John didn't run in the opposite direction like most people would. Instead, he moved toward it. Toward the gun. Toward the chaos, toward his cousin, trying to stop it. That decision says everything about the kind of person he was. But it also makes what happened next even more devastating. Because nothing about that day suggested it would be his last. There was no clear warning. No visible sign that the situation would escalate into something deadly. Just a call, a meeting, and a moment that would change everything. And the most painful part is this. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't a normal call. Tremonte Terrell Gibson was just 20 years old. At that age, most people are still trying to figure out direction, where they fit, who they are becoming, what their future might look like. But in Gibson's case, the picture that emerges is far more complicated. There wasn't a clear path. There wasn't stability. And on the day everything happened, there were signs that something beneath the surface wasn't sitting right. He had gone to the Azure Estates apartment complex to visit his girlfriend. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't out of place. People came and went there all the time, and Gibson blended into that normal flow without drawing attention. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was simply there, sitting outside, passing time. At one point, he was seated on a bench, smoking marijuana. To anyone walking by, it likely looked ordinary. A young man waiting, killing time. Nothing about that moment would have raised alarms. But what wasn't visible to others was what he later described. Because when Gibson spoke after the incident, his words painted a very different picture of what was going on inside his head. He talked about being harassed. He talked about people targeting him, and more disturbingly, he talked about demons. Not metaphorically, not casually, but as if they were real, as if they were present, as if the people around him weren't just people, but something else entirely. That shift in perception changes everything. Because when someone begins to see others as threats that aren't clearly grounded in reality, their reactions can become unpredictable. Ordinary interactions start to feel personal. Neutral moments feel hostile. And tension builds, not necessarily because of what's actually happening, but because of how it's being interpreted. And in Gibson's case, that interpretation was already taking shape before anyone else even arrived. He wasn't just sitting there, he was waiting. Waiting with a mindset that, by his own later account, was already on edge. Already defensive. Already preparing for something he believed was coming. At some point, he reached out to his cousin, John. He asked him to bring a bag. Inside that bag was a gun. That detail alone raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer. If this was just a normal visit, why involve a weapon? And if it wasn't normal, then what did Gibson believe was about to happen? Because by the time John and the others arrived, whatever Gibson was thinking had already taken hold. In his mind, something wasn't right. The people approaching him weren't just familiar faces. They weren't just individuals he knew. They were something else. Something threatening. Something he felt he had to confront. Every movement, every word, every glance could have been interpreted through that lens. And when perception shifts like that, reality starts to follow. By the time the group closed the distance between them, the situation had already been shaped. Not by what was actually unfolding, but by what Gibson believed was unfolding. And that belief would dictate what happened next. Because instead of stepping away, instead of de-escalating, he reached for the weapon. And then, he made a decision that would change everything. Minutes later, 3 men approached the area where Gibson was sitting. John was among them. But the moment they got close enough, something felt off. There was a pause, a shift in energy, the kind of subtle tension that doesn't immediately explode but sits there, waiting. One of the men spoke first. "What's going on?" It wasn't confrontational. It sounded like confusion more than anything else. Another voice followed. "Why'd you call me out here?" That question hung in the air for a second, long enough to matter. Because it showed something important. Even before anything happened, there was uncertainty. John and the others hadn't walked into a clear situation. They were trying to figure it out in real time. And Gibson, still near that bench, still in the same spot, was now facing them directly. What he saw in that moment wasn't necessarily what they intended. But perception doesn't always match reality, and whatever he believed was happening was already guiding his next move. The distance between them closed. Not aggressively, not quickly. Just enough for words to be exchanged, for body language to be read, for tension to rise without anyone fully understanding why. It's in moments like this, quiet, uncertain, unresolved, that everything can still go either way. Someone could walk away, someone could calm things down. Someone could ask the right question, but none of that happened. Instead, something shifted. Gibson's posture changed, his focus narrowed, and without any clear warning to the others, he reached for the weapon. There was no long argument, no visible countdown, no moment where everyone realized what was about to happen. Just a sudden movement, a decision made in an instant. And then, without warning, the first shot came without any clear warning. 1 second, there were questions in the air, confusion, uncertainty, people trying to understand why they had been called there. And the next, Gunfire. Loud. Sharp. Immediate. It cut through the space so suddenly that for a split second no one reacted. It was the kind of moment where your brain hasn't caught up to reality yet, where what just happened doesn't fully register, but then it did. And everything broke apart at once. One of the men was hit almost instantly, struck in the head before he even had time to move. His body dropped, and that's when panic took over. People turned and ran in different directions, some ducking behind cars, others sprinting for cover with no clear destination in mind. The calm that existed just moments earlier was gone, replaced by chaos. Voices rose, feet pounded against pavement, doors slammed, the sound of gunfire echoed again, sending waves of fear through anyone still within range. And in the middle of all of it, John didn't run. While others were trying to escape, he moved forward, toward the gun, toward the person holding it, toward his cousin. It's a decision that's hard to fully process in a moment like that. Instinct tells most people to get away, to create distance between themselves and danger. But John did the opposite. Whether it was instinct, loyalty, or a desperate attempt to stop what was happening, he stepped in. He closed the distance between them. Fast. Close enough to reach him. Close enough to try. There are moments in situations like this where time seems to slow down, not because things are actually moving slower, but because every movement suddenly matters. Every second carries weight. John lunged in, attempting to disarm him, hands reaching, bodies colliding, a brief struggle in the middle of chaos. For a split second, it looked like something might change, like maybe, just maybe, this could be stopped. But control had already been lost. The situation wasn't stabilizing, it was escalating. The weapon was still in play, and in that moment of close contact, everything became even more dangerous. The space between them disappeared completely. Movement became unpredictable. Fear, adrenaline, confusion, it all collided at once. And then, more shots. Closer this time, louder, more direct. John was hit not once, multiple times. His body reacted instantly, the force of the gunfire pushing him back. The attempt to intervene, the effort to stop it, ended in the same violence he was trying to prevent. He went down between two buildings, the noise of everything around him continuing, even as his own moment came to a stop. Around him, the chaos didn't pause. People were still running, still shouting, still trying to understand what was happening. But for John, the situation had already changed in the most irreversible way possible. And the weight of that moment is what makes this case so difficult to process. Because he didn't just happen to be there. He stepped in. He tried to stop it. Trying to prevent more people from getting hurt. Trying to reach someone he believed he could still get through to. His own cousin. In those final moments, this wasn't just about survival, it was about intervention. The shooting at the apartment complex didn't end when John went down, it spread. In the immediate aftermath, as people were still trying to process what had just happened, Tremonte Gibson moved away from the scene, but not in a way that suggested it was over. There was no pause, no sign of stopping. The violence simply shifted locations. He fled the complex, still armed. And now, instead of a contained situation, it became unpredictable. As he moved through the area, the danger followed him. At one point, he approached vehicles. People inside them completely unaware of what they were about to face. These weren't individuals involved in the earlier confrontation. They were just there, driving, sitting, going about their day. And suddenly, they were in the middle of it. Gibson attempted to take control of vehicles, forcing his way toward drivers, turning ordinary moments into life-threatening encounters. When resistance came, or when things didn't go the way he expected, the gun was used again. Shots were fired into vehicles, glass shattered, people inside were injured. The randomness of it made everything worse. Because now there was no clear target, no defined situation, just movement and violence attached to it. One victim was forced out of a Chevrolet Silverado at gunpoint. Another was hit while still inside their vehicle. The incidents stacked quickly, each one adding to the confusion spreading across the area. And while this was happening, word began to travel, not through official announcements or coordinated updates, but through people. Calls, shouts, fragments of information passed from one person to another. There's a shooter. Stay inside. Someone's been shot. By the time it began to settle, multiple people had been injured across different points of the incident. What started as a confrontation at a single location had turned into something much larger, something that moved, expanded, and affected individuals who had no connection to the original situation. And that escalation is what defines this phase of the case. The violence didn't continue forever, but the questions it left behind did. After the series of shootings and attempted carjackings, Tremonte Gibson was eventually taken into custody. By that point, the situation had already unfolded across multiple locations, leaving behind injured victims, damaged vehicles, and one life lost. But what stood out most wasn't just what he had done, it was what he said afterward. When Gibson spoke, his explanation didn't follow a clear, logical sequence. Instead, it pointed to something much harder to understand. He told authorities that he was trying to get rid of demons, not in a symbolic way, not as an expression of stress or frustration, but as if those demons were real. Something he believed he needed to confront, something he believed was present in the people around him. And according to what he said, the individuals he shot were those demons. That statement alone shifts how this case is viewed, because it raises a difficult question. Was this an intentional act directed at specific people, or was it driven by a distorted perception of reality? That uncertainty only deepened during his court appearance. Standing before the judge, Gibson's behavior didn't match the gravity of what had happened. At times he appeared disconnected from the reality of the situation. He made statements suggesting that he was being followed, that something was attached to him, that he was reacting to forces others couldn't see. At one point, he even pushed back against the idea that anyone had died, despite clear evidence confirming the loss of life. And through all of it, there was one detail that stood out to many observing the case. There was no visible remorse, no clear emotional response to the fact that one of the victims was his own cousin. No acknowledgement of the weight of what had happened. That absence made the situation even more unsettling. Because when someone acts with that level of detachment, it becomes harder to determine where intent ends and something else begins. This moment in the case reveals a different layer, not just what happened, but the state of mind behind it. And it leaves a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Was this planned, or something far more unpredictable? Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Do you think this was something that was thought out ahead of time? Or does it feel like a complete breakdown in the moment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and they always bring different perspectives to cases like this. And if you've been following the story so far, take a second to like the video and subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles. It really helps the channel grow and keeps stories like this being told. When you step back from the sequence of events, a clearer picture begins to form. Not a simple one, but one made up of several factors that collided in a short amount of time. First, there was tension. Not the kind that's always visible or openly expressed, but something that existed beneath the surface. Gibson later claimed he felt harassed, that the people around him were targeting him in some way. Whether those concerns were grounded in reality or not, they shaped how he interpreted everything that happened that day. What might have seemed like a normal interaction to others could have felt like a confrontation to him. Then, there was his state of mind. His own statements about demons suggest that he wasn't seeing the situation in a typical way. The people approaching him weren't just individuals he knew. They were, in his words, something he believed he had to confront. That kind of thinking removes the normal boundaries that guide behavior. It shifts reactions from measured to immediate, from cautious to extreme. And then, there's the most critical factor: access to a weapon. Because regardless of what he believed or felt in that moment, the presence of a gun turned that mindset into action. Without it, the situation might have remained verbal, or at worst, physical. But with it, everything escalated in seconds. There was no delay between thought and consequence. When those three elements come together, internal tension, altered perception, and immediate access to a firearm, the margin for control disappears. And that's exactly what happened here. Now the question becomes, was this targeted or impulsive? On one hand, Gibson contacted his cousin and asked him to come to the location. That suggests a level of intent. It wasn't a random encounter. John didn't just happen to be there. He was called. But on the other hand, the way the situation unfolded doesn't follow a controlled plan. The shooting extended beyond John. Multiple people were injured. The violence moved from the apartment complex into surrounding areas, involving individuals who had no connection to the initial interaction. That kind of escalation doesn't reflect a focused objective. It reflects loss of control. So rather than fitting cleanly into one category, this case sits somewhere in between. There are signs of deliberate action, making the call, requesting the bag, but also clear signs that once it began, it expanded beyond anything contained or predictable. And that overlap is what makes it so difficult to define, because it wasn't entirely planned, and it wasn't entirely random. It was a situation where perception, access, and decision-making all collided in a way that left very little room for anything else to happen. Cases like this don't just leave behind questions about what happened. They force us to look at the patterns that build up before moments like this ever occur. And when everything settles, when the noise fades and the movement stops, the focus comes back to one person. John Richard Halliburton III. A 25-year-old who didn't expect that day to be his last. Someone who answered a call from family, not knowing what he was stepping into. Someone who, when things turned violent, didn't move away from it, but toward it. He didn't run, he didn't turn his back, he tried to stop it. That choice defines how he's remembered in this story, not just as a victim, but as someone who acted in a moment where others were trying to escape. And that's what makes the loss feel even heavier. Because it wasn't just a life taken, it was a life that stepped forward, a presence in a family, a connection in a community. Something that can't be replaced. It didn't have to end this way. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe these cases should be told, remembered, and understood, take a moment to subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles. Like the video if it impacted you, and share it so more people can hear what happened here, because every time a story like this is told, it keeps the focus where it belongs, on the lives that were lost, and the moments that should have never happened.